This is a Sikha from Lakota Sikhas, Chelek Tazayin, Parshas Teruma, Sikha Gimel. And the topic of the Sikha is that in this week's Parsha, we learned the pasuk of Va'osuli Mikdash V'shachanti B'Seichem. And there are 5 parts in the Sikha. The Rebbe, number 1, asks 3 questions about the teachings of the Rambam in Hilchos Beis Abchira and in Hilchos Malachim. Number 2, asks 2 other questions on what the Rambam teaches in Hilchos Malachim. Number 3, answer these 2 final questions. Number 4, based on this, answer the first 3 questions. And number 5, present the teaching in halacha, as well as the meaning of this in Pnimiyas HaInyanim. The Rambam in Hilchos Beis Abchira learns from the pasuk, which is in our parsha, the pasuk of Va'osuli Mikdash V'shachanti B'Seichem. So this is in Hilchos Beis Abchira, Perek Aleph, Mishnah Aleph, at the very beginning. Mitzvah Sasei La'ases Bayis LaHashem Muchan Liyes Makrivim B'ya Karbanis. It's a mitzvah Sasei to build a house for Hashem where one can offer karbanis. Shenemar, as it says in the pasuk, Va'osuli Mikdash, and you should make a mikdash for me. The Rambam continues, Ukvar Nisparish Batera Mishkan She'asa Moshe Rabbeinu. The Torah already teaches in details the Mishkan that Moshe Rabbeinu built, and that was temporary. Shenemar, as it says in Sefer Dvarim and Parshas Re'eh, Ki lo basem ad ato v'gemer, because you have not yet arrived ela menucha v'ela nachala, to the final resting place, where only then will it be the permanent place of the Beis HaMikdash. However, in Hilchos Malachim, the Rambam learns this halacha of building the Beis HaMikdash from a different pasuk. The Rambam writes in Hilchos Malachim, Perek Aleph, Mishnah Aleph, Shalish mitzvahs nitztavu Yisrael b'shas knisasan la'aretz. The Yidden were commanded about 3 mitzvahs at the time that they entered the land of Eretz Yisrael, and he details the first 2 mitzvahs of appointing a king and of destroying Amalek, and then he continues v'livneis Beis HaBchira, and to build the Beis HaBchira, the Beis HaMikdash, shenemar, as it says, and he brings a pasuk from Parshas Re'eh, l'shichnei tidrushu ubasa shama. You should seek Hashem's presence and go there. So you have to go to a specific place, which is the Beis HaMikdash. And the question over here is known. Why doesn't the Rambam here in Hilchos Malachim bring the same pasuk that he brings earlier in Hilchos Beis Abchira, the pasuk of Va'osuli Mikdash V'shachanti B'Seichem? So the Lechem Mishnah answers that the pasuk of Va'osuli Mikdash V'shachanti B'Seichem is referring to the Mishkan which was in the Midbar, and the pasuk of L'shichnei tidrushu basa shama is referring to Mishkan Shilei, as indeed Rashi explains in his Pirush on the Torah that this pasuk is referring to Mishkan Shilei, and so therefore explains the Lechem Mishnah that just like in Shilei and in the Midbar, it's a mitzvah to build the Mishkan and the Beis HaMikdash. So certainly in the Beis HaBchira, which is the ultimate and permanent and final place of the Beis HaMikdash, certainly there it's also a mitzvah. However, there are 2 difficulties with this answer of the Lechem Mishnah. Number 1, since the Rambam counts the building of a bayis LaHashem as a mitzvah sasei, as he says at the beginning of Hilchos Beis HaBchira, mitzvah sasei la'ases bayis LaHashem, meaning that it's a mitzvah for all generations, so why does he bring a pasuk which speaks about the building of the Mishkan? The Lechem Mishnah is saying that the pasuk Va'osuli Mikdash refers to the Mishkan HaMidbar. Why would the Rambam bring that pasuk for his teaching that it's a mitzvah sasei la'ases bayis LaHashem, which means a mitzvah sasei for all generations? So why is he bringing a pasuk that speaks of the Mishkan HaMidbar according to the Lechem Mishnah? And number 2, why would the Rambam bring in Hilchos Beis HaBchira, where the whole point over here is to teach, like its name, Hilchos Beis HaBchira, is to teach all about the mitzvah sasei of building the Beis HaMikdash? Why is he bringing a pasuk where the tzivah is on the Mishkan, and in Hilchos Malachim, where it teaches about the mitzvah sasei of appointing a melech, like the name Hilchos Malachim, and he just brings, as an aside it seems, the other 2 mitzvahs that had to be done when entering Eretz Yisrael, besides for appointing a king, also destroying Amalek and building the Beis HaMikdash? So why in Hilchos Malachim, which is about appointing a melech, he brings the pasuk of L'shichnei tidrushu, which refers to Mishkan Shilei, and according to some Mefarshim, it actually refers to the Beis Elamim, to the final Beis HaMikdash. Why does the Rambam bringing in Hilchos Beis HaBchira, which is all about the mitzvah of building the Beis HaMikdash, the pasuk that refers to the Mishkan in the Midbar, and in Hilchos Malachim, which is all about appointing a king, there he brings the pasuk which speaks either of the later Beis HaMikdash, the Mishkan Shilei, which was more permanent, or even possibly, according to some of Mefarshim, it talks about the final and ultimate and permanent Beis HaMikdash. Now, l'cha'era, seemingly, we can answer differently than the Lechem Mishnah, that the Rambam in Hilchos Beis HaBchira brings the pasuk of Va'osuli Mikdash Not because it relates to the Mishkan of Moshe Rabbeinu, the Mishkan of the Midbar, as the Lechem Mishnah says, but rather because it's from there that we learn the mitzvah of building the Beis HaMikdash, as we indeed find in Midrashim that they explain that from Va'osuli Mikdash we learn about the mitzvah of building the Beis HaMikdash. It doesn't relate to the Mishkan in the Midbar. However, there are two difficulties with this answer. Number one, if that's the case, that we learn out the mitzvah of building the Beis HaMikdash from the pasuk of Va'osuli Mikdash, then number one, why does the Rambam bring a different pasuk in Hilchos Malachim? He should bring the pasuk again, also in Hilchos Malachim, because this is the pasuk from where we learn the mitzvah of building the Beis HaMikdash. And number two, this question becomes amplified and more pronounced, since it seems like the source of the Rambam's teaching in Hilchos Malachim is from the Medrash, where over there the Medrash indeed brings the pasuk of Asuli Mikdash. So if that's the source of the mitzvah of building the Beis HaMikdash, and in the source of the Rambam it brings that pasuk, then it becomes even stronger and more difficult why the Rambam doesn't bring it in Hilchos Malachim. It says over there in the Medrash that Al Shloisha Dvarim Nitztavu Yisrael B'chnisas La'aretz. It's pretty much exactly what the Rambam says, that the Yidden were commanded about three mitzvahs when they entered Eretz Yisrael. Number one, Limlis Alei Melech, to appoint for themselves a king, V'lifnis Lam Beis HaBchira, and to build the Beis HaMikdash, U'lahachros Shmoi Zarei Shel Amalek, and to destroy the offspring, the Zera of Amalek. And he explains, Limnis Lam Melech, where do we learn to appoint a king? D'chsiv Seibim Tasam Alech HaMelech. Where do we learn Livnis Lam Beis HaBchira? D'chsiv, it says, V'asuli Mikdash, brings the pasuk, V'asuli Mikdash. And Lahachros Zarei Shel Amalek, d'chsiv, we learn that from V'hoya B'neiach Hashem Alekecha, and Timcha Zecher Amalek. So if it's true that we learn the mitzvah of building the Beis HaMikdash from the pasuk of V'asuli Mikdash, then the Rambam should have brought that also in Hilchos Malachim, especially since in the source of the Rambam, it brings that pasuk. After those two attempted answers on our first question, now we're going to move on to present another question, and that is that there's a clear pasuk and tzivui to build the Beis HaMikdash, not like Va'asuli Mikdash, which indeed, like the Lechem Mishnah says, simply speaks of the Mishkan and the Midbar. It says in Parshas Re'eh, we already had one pasuk in Parshas Re'eh, L'shichni Tidrishu V'asa Shama. This is a pasuk right nearby, or a little later, where there it says, V'hoya Amakim Asher Yivchar Hashem Alekeichem B'eh. There'll be the place that Hashem will choose, L'shakin Shmei Sham, to rest His name over there. And as we find that it's brought in Gemara and Sifri, that this is a source for the mitzvah to build the Beis HaMikdash. And so the question is, why doesn't the Rambam bring this pasuk in Hilchos Beis HaBchira? So that's our second question. Our first question is about the difference of which pasuk the Rambam brings in Hilchos Beis HaBchira and Hilchos Malachim. And the second question is, going to Hilchos Beis HaBchira, where it's primarily about teaching about the Beis HaMikdash, why doesn't the Rambam bring a pasuk which refers directly to the Beis HaMikdash and not the pasuk that simply speaks of the Mishkan? So the Kesef Mishnah answers this question, and he explains that the Rambam holds that the pasuk of Ahoya Amokim, it isn't the tzivit to build the Beis HaMikdash, but rather it's just said as a story, as a sipur dvarm. If you look at the pasuk over there says V'hoya Amokim Asher Yivchar Hashem Alekeichem B'eh L'shakin Shmei Sham. So the pasuk then continues and says, Shama Taviu es kol asher nechim etzave eschem oileseichem v'zivcheichem masreseichem v'trumas yadchem v'chol mivchar nidrechem asher tidru la Hashem. So it's not telling us a command to build this place, but rather it's a sipur dvarim, that when this place is built, which we didn't have the command for it here, there's a command for it elsewhere, that's the place where you should bring your karbanis. And so therefore the Rambam can bring this as the source for the mitzvah of building the Beis HaMikdash. Now regarding the Gemara and Sifri, that they bring this pasuk, so the Kesef Mishnah explains that the reason the Gemara and Sifri bring this pasuk is only as a proof that Acharas Zarish al Amalek is Kedemis Lubinin Beis HaBchira. It's for the order that first comes the destruction of Amalek, and then comes the building of the Beis HaBchira. Like if you look in the Gemara over there, you'll see that that's what it says. It says over there that Acharas Zarish al Amalek comes before Binin Beis HaBchira. How do we know this? And it brings this pasuk of Ahoya Amakim, and it says what's written right before this pasuk. It says V'yiniach lechem mikolei veichem misaviv v'yishaftem betach, that it's only after there is the destruction of Amalek and destroyed all the enemies, then V'hoya Amakim. So the Gemara and Sifri are not even bringing it as a source for the mitzvah of building the Beis HaBchira. They're bringing it as a source that the destruction of Amalek comes before the building of the Beis HaBchira. However, the difficulty with this answer is that according to this, in addition to the difficulty, that there's a rule, which is that the Rambam brings the simplest explanation, even if it isn't found in Shas. And so the simplest explanation of the pasuk V'hoya Makam Asher Yivchar Hashem Alekeichem Bo L'Shakin Shmoi Sham is that it's a tzivui. So the Rambam should have brought this as the tzivui for the building of the Beis HaMikdash, and not Vasul Mikdash, which simply, like we said, refers to the Mishkan. In addition to that difficulty, there's another difficulty, which is why doesn't the Rambam bring this, the V'hoya Makim, in Hilchas Malachim as the proof that Achrosas Zarish Alamalik Kodemes Lebinin Beis Abchira? Because in Hilchas Malachim, the Rambam starts off in Parak Aleph, Mishnah Aleph, by saying that there's the three mitzvahs, like we quoted earlier. And then in Halacha Beis, the Rambam says, Minui Melech is Kodem L'Melchamas Amalek. And he brings the pasuk Shenemar. Then he continues and says, V'achrosas Zera Amalek Kodemes Lebinin Abayis. And then he says, Shenemar, what's the pasuk? He doesn't bring this pasuk for Hayamakim. He brings two pasukim from Shmuel. But there's a pasuk over there. It's a pasuk Aleph and then a pasuk Beis, both in Parak Zayin and Shmuel Beis. It says in pasuk Aleph over there, "Vayiki Yashav Hamelech Beveisev Hashem Iniach LeMisaviv Mikol Oivav," that there were no more enemies. And then it says in the next pasuk Beis, "Vayimer Hamelech Al Nasan Hanavi Anoichi Yeshiv Bebeis Harazim," that he has to build a house for Hashem. Why does the Rambam bring that as his proof? If we're going to say that the Rambam learns that V'hoya Hamokim is being brought in the Gemara only as the order, as a proof of the order, that first comes Achrosas Zarish Alamalik, and then comes the Binyan Beis Abchira, why doesn't the Rambam bring that as his proof also in Hilchas Beis Abchira for the order? In addition to these two questions, and really we have a third question over here, which is what we just asked, even though it only came up as a question on the Kesef Mishnah, but now it's also a question for us. Why doesn't the Rambam bring the pasuk of Ahoya Amakim as the proof for the order that Achrosas Zerish Alamolik comes before Binyan Beis Abchira? But in addition to the two main questions, we also have to understand why the Rambam in Hilchas Beis Abchira, after concluding Halacha Aleph with saying, so this is Hilchas Beis Abchira, which we only learned Parak Aleph, Mishnah Aleph. He concludes over there with saying, the Torah already details to us the Mishkan that Moshe made, and it was only temporary, as it says, you did not yet arrive to the final resting place. Why does he continue in Halacha Beis and say that cave and Shenichnasul Aretz, since they didn't enter the land, Mishkan ba Gilgal. They set up the Mishkan in Gilgal, Abre Shana for 14 years, when they were busy conquering and dividing the land. After those 14 years, they came to Shile. And there they built, unlike the previous structures, this was a structure of stone. Uparsu Urias HaMishkan Olav. The roof, however, was still made out of material. They spread the Urias, the materials of the Mishkan upon it. It didn't have a regular roof. Shana Amad Mishkan Shiloi. And this Mishkan stood for 369 years. And then when Eli passed away, Charav, it was destroyed. Ubol in Noiv, and then they came to a place called Noiv. Ubanu Shal Mikdash, they built a Mikdash there. Shmuel, and when Shmuel passed away, Charav, it too was destroyed, the one in Noiv. Ubol the Given, and they arrived in Given. Ubanu Shal Mikdash, and they built a Mikdash over there as well. Given Bo the Beis Lamim, and from Given they then arrived finally to the Beis HaMikdash. And the years of Nev and Givin were 57 years. And the Rebbe is going to present a question on this. And the question over here is, the Rambam is a Sefer Halachas. So why does the Rambam write this whole lengthiness about the Mishkan being in these various places? First Gilgal, then Shilei, then Nev, and then Givin. The Rambam is the Sefer Halachas, not a Sefer of history. Now, even though the source of this teaching in the Rambam is in the Mishnah Maseches Vachim, however, in Mishnayos in general, there are a number of anyonim which aren't halachas, unlike the Sefer Ayad, which is exclusively and entirely just a Sefer of halachas. And in addition, in that Mishnah over there, Maseches Vachim, it's taught together with halachas that changed during those times. When the barmas were permitted, when the barmas became forbidden, the change in the location and the movement of the Mishkan affected a halacha. So it's taught in the context of halacha until the point of Kevan Shenivna Mikdash B'Yerushalayim, that once the base of Mikdash was built in Yerushalayim, so Nasru Kol Amakaimis Kulan Livnes Behen Be'ayis LaHashem Ulahakriv Ben Karbon. So over there it's written in the context of halachas. Now understandably the Rambam doesn't teach this with the halachas, since even those halachas, my dahava hava, they were in the past. They're not relevant today because the base of Mikdash was built, and so you have the final halacha which the Rambam teaches, which is once the base of Mikdash was built in Yerushalayim, so now all places are forbidden. However, according to this, it's even more difficult. Number one, that the Rambam mentions the history. He doesn't mention the halachas, and we understand why not. But now he's mentioning just history. Number two, he mentions the years, which is even a great detail in addition to just the change of location. And number three, even the Mishnah doesn't mention the years. So what's this whole lengthiness in the Rambam? So we'll understand this by first explaining the reason for the following. And there are two questions over here. The first question is, why in Hilchas Malachim, where it teaches about the mitzvah of Minui Melech, so these are the halachas of Minui Melech, so why in those halachas does the Rambam also teach about the mitzvah of building the Beis HaMikdash? And actually in all three mitzvahs, he also teaches about the mitzvah of destroying Amalek. Why is he mentioning these other two mitzvahs of building the Beis HaMikdash and destroying Amalek in Hilchas Malachim, which is about the halachas of Minui Melech? Similarly, we find in Sefer HaMitzvahs the same type of question. When the Rambam lists the mitzvah of building the Beis HaMikdash, so not the mitzvah of Minei Melech, but the mitzvah of building the Beis HaMikdash, he says, V'loshen Sefri, the Loshen of the Sefri is that Sholish mitzvahs nitztav Yisrael be'es knisas and laretz, that the Yidden were commanded to do three mitzvahs when they entered the land of Eretz Yisrael. Number one, limnis lahem melech, to appoint a king. Number two, v'livnes lahem beis abchira, to build a Beis HaMikdash. And number three, v'lahachar zarish al-Amalek, to destroy Amalek. And here too, it's not understood. What's the connection between the other two mitzvahs of appointing a king, Minui Melech, and destroying Amalek, to the mitzvah of building the Beis HaMikdash? So when the Rambam teaches in Hilchas Malachim the mitzvah of Minui Melech, he mentions the other two mitzvahs. And in Sefer HaMitzvahs, where he teaches the mitzvah of the Beis HaMikdash, he mentions the other two mitzvahs as well. In addition, a related question is, we also have to understand why the Rambam begins with saying, just like in the Gemara and Sifri, that it's Shalish mitzvahs. He immediately lists the mitzvahs. So why does he have to say their number? He could just say that the Yidden were commanded to appoint a king, to build the Beis HaMikdash, and destroy Amalek when they entered the land of Eretz Yisrael, or when the Yidden entered the land of Eretz Yisrael, they were commanded to, and mentioned the three mitzvahs. Minyan Alamali, what do we need a number for? And we can't say it's answered by the teaching of Rashi in the Gemara over there. When the Gemara says it, so Rashi says, Lahocha Naket Shalosh Halalu, the reason why he chose these three, Shein Tluya Zubazu, because they're connected to one another, La Seis and Kesidron, because they have to be done in a specific order. First Melech, and V'acharei Amalek, V'acharei Beis HaBchira. There's an order. That's why the Gemara mentions all three mitzvahs, because they're connected to one another. First, they then have to appoint a king, then they have to destroy Amalek, and then they build the Beis HaMikdash. This is not going to answer our question, since this only explains why Nakat Shalosh Halalu, why he's saying all three, which relates to our first question. But it doesn't answer why he has to say that it's Shalosh mitzvahs. We could see for ourselves that it's three mitzvahs. There's no need to mention. It would seem that there's no need to mention the number. The explanation in this is as follows. The three mitzvahs, in the words of Rashi, are tluyis zubazu. What does it mean that they are tluyis zubazu? This means that even though they are three separate mitzvahs, there are three separate mitzvahs here. One is to appoint a king, one is to destroy Amalek, and one is to build a Beis HaMikdash. There are three separate mitzvahs, but they're tluyis zubazu. And that means that despite them being three separate mitzvahs, nevertheless each mitzvah is also a detail and brings a shleimus to the other two. The shleimus of Minui Melech is achieved when Lahachar Zarish al Amalek and Binyan Beis HaBchira are also fulfilled. And the same is true by the other two mitzvahs, including that the shleimus of Binyan Beis HaBchira is connected to fulfilling the mitzvahs of Minui Melech and Milchemes Amalek. That means the mitzvah itself is only whole and complete when the other two mitzvahs are also fulfilled. Now, in addition to this, as Rashi says, we also learn from the pasuk that the connection zubazu is not just in their very existence and their own shleimus, but it's also in regards to the order. That first comes Minei Melech, then comes Lahachar Zarish al Amalek, and afterwards the Binyan Beis HaBchira. This means that the order is not just in the time of the chiyuv and kiyum of the mitzvahs that's on the yidden, that the yidden have to fulfill it in a certain time and in a certain order, which is referring to the shalish mitzvahs nitztavu Yisrael, which is the gavra. It's not just something which relates to the gavra, the order that the gavra has to fulfill the mitzvahs. Rather, it's a detail and aspect in Minei Melech, in the cheftza. Considering the gather of melech, when we look at what is a melech, In order for the Melech to have a shleimus of a Melech, there must be Melchemes Amalek and the Binyan Beis Abchira. And so too, considering the gather of the Beis HaMikdash, there must be Minyan Melech and Melchemes Amalek. And that's why the Rambam brings, both in Hilchos Malachim, when he talks about Minyan Melech, and also in Sefer Mitzvahs, where he talks about the mitzvah of Binyan Beis HaMikdash, he brings all three mitzvahs, because the shleimus of each of the mitzvahs depends on the other two mitzvahs being fulfilled as well. And this is also the reason, a question which we mentioned earlier, that the Rambam brings in Halacha Beis, when he talks about the order of fulfilling the mitzvahs, he brings the psukim from Shmuel, where it says, Vayiki Yashav HaMelech Bebeisai, V'Hashem iniach le'mesavev mikol oivav, that after there was the destruction of the enemies, so then Vayemer HaMelech Nasal Navi, Anechi Yeshev Bebeis HaRazim, he talks about building the Beis HaMikdash. The proof in the psukim is not just about the order and time of the mitzvahs, because for that the psukim which the Gemara presents, which is from earlier, from the Chumash, which is V'Iniach Lechem Mikol Oivechem, V'Hayamokim Asher Yifcha from Parshas Re'eh, that would be enough. These psukim are brought, they're mainly brought that it's to teach us that it's an inyan and gather in fulfilling the mitzvah of Minyan Melech and Melchemes Amalek. Like we see in the words, Vayiki Yashav HaMelech Beveisei, V'Hashem iniach lo misavev, Vayemer HaMelech. It's relevant to the Melech being a Melech. It's not just the order, but it actually affects the fulfillment and the shleimus of the mitzvah and the existence and the gather and the chefza of the Melech. And now we can understand why the Rambam brings all three mitzvahs in Hilchos Malachim, and also in Sefer HaMitzvahs about the Binyan Beis HaMikdash, since they are dependent and connected to one another. And that's also why he says that they're shalish mitzvahs. Because by saying that they're shalish mitzvahs, he's telling us that they're one entity, that they have a connection to one another in their very shleimus, in their very gather, in their very chefza itself. According to this explanation, we could now go back and answer our original questions. And we're going to begin by answering part of question 1 and the whole of question 2. Because question 1 really had two parts. One part was, why does the Rambam bring the pasuk of Asur Mikdash in Hilchos Beis Abchira? And the other part was, why does the Rambam bring the pasuk of L'shichne Tidushu Basa Shama in Hilchos Malachim? So we're going to answer why the Rambam brings the pasuk of Asur Mikdash in Hilchos Beis Abchira, and later we'll answer why the Rambam brings the pasuk of L'shichne Tidushu Basa Shama in Hilchos Malachim. And we're also going to answer why doesn't the Rambam bring the pasuk of Hayamokim Asher Yifcha Hashem Elokechem Bay L'Shakin Shmei Sham in Hilchos Beis Abchira. So according to this, we can understand why the Rambam says in the beginning of Hilchos Beis Abchira that mitzvahs asay lasis bayis laHashem muchon. What's the source of this mitzvah? Shenamar va'asuli mikdash. And then he continues and says, the Torah already details to us the Mishkan that Moshe Rabbeinu made, and it was only temporary. The Rambam is teaching here that the mitzvah to build a bayis laHashem also applies to the Mishkan which Moshe Rabbeinu built. And at the end of the Sikha, we'll see what the nafkamina and halacha is from this. Now, since the building of the Binyan Beis HaMikdash is like what we learned, is connected with the other two mitzvahs, meaning that for the gather of the Binyan Beis HaMikdash, the earlier Kiyum of Minyan Melech, which is the first mitzvah, and the Beniach of Melchemes Amalek, which is the second mitzvah, they have to first be fulfilled. So therefore we must say that's how it was by all Batei Mikdash. Meaning that even though these are shalish mitzvahs, which Nistav Yisrael B'Shas Knisas and La'aretz, and here they're not yet in Eretz Yisrael, that's only regarding all three mitzvahs. The three mitzvahs, each one individually, when you look at them, they had the time they were commanded. However, since mitzvahs bin ba'is l'Hashem is one tzivui for all generations, which is the tzivui that of Asur Mikdash, which includes all the structures that were made, including that of Moshe Rabbeinu. So it's understood that also by each of the previous binyan hamikdash, including the Mishkan, there already was a melech and Hachros Zarish Alamalek. The Hiniach Mikol Avechem Isavev. Since Tluya Zubazu, otherwise is lacking in the Mishkan. So it has to be that also in the Mishkan of Moshe Rabbeinu, there already was the Minyan Melech and the destruction of Amalek. However, just like the Shleimus and the Beis HaMikdash for all generations was only in the Binyan Beis HaElamim, when Kishenivna HaMikdash B'Yerushalayim, that's only when it was in its real total Shleimus. So too, all the introductory conditions in Gedarim, that of Minyan Melech and Melchemes Amalek, they were also only accomplished with the Shleimus through the Binyan Beis HaMikdash in Yerushalayim. So yes, just like the Beis HaMikdash itself was on a higher level when it was in Yerushalayim, so too the other mitzvahs of Minyan Melech and Melchemes Amalek were on a higher level at that time. But at the same time, just like the building of the Beis HaMikdash, starting from the Mishkan, is connected to the mitzvah of Mikdash, so you're also going to have the other two mitzvahs on a lower level, but you'll have them then fulfilled as well. And this is the reason the Rambam brings the pasuk of Asur Mikdash and immediately continues, Ukvar Nisparish B'Torah Mishkan She'asa Moshe Rabbeinu V'Haya Lefi Shah. what's the Rambam saying over here? He's saying that the straightforward meaning of the tzivui of also the Mikdash was for the Mishkan which Moshe made, and he's teaching us that also with the Mishkan, which is what Moshe Rabbeinu made, they fulfilled the mitzvahs binyan bayis Hashem with all of the G'darim. How do you have the G'darim over there? Since Moshe Rabbeinu melech haya, as the Rambam writes elsewhere, and it was also after the menucha from Melchemes Amalek, like we learned in Parashas B'Shalach, that vayachalish Yeshua Amalek v'esami lefi charav. And this teaches us that from then on the chiyuv of the tzivay of Asuli Mikdash continued for all time. So Rambam is telling us that the mitzvah of binyan beis Mikdash already started from Moshe Rabbeinu. It started already from then. Yes, the shleimus is only in Yerushalayim, and as a result, the other mitzvahs connected to it are only b'shleimus then as well. But already from the time of Moshe Rabbeinu, even though it's before Knisas and La'aretz, when you don't yet have the other mitzvahs, but the mitzvah of Beis Mikdash already started, and so you're going to have elements of the other mitzvahs there as well, because they're tluya zu b'zu. Otherwise, this mitzvah is lacking. And so that's what the Rambam's teaching us, that the mitzvahs asay of la'aseh bayis la'Hashem muchan is already learned out from the Mishkan of Moshe Rabbeinu and already started by the Mishkan of Moshe Rabbeinu. And again, at the end of the Sikha, we'll see what's the nafkamina that comes out of this. Now we're going to move on to answering question number 3, which was about the lengthiness of the Rambam, talking about all the different mishkanos from the Midbar to Gilgal to Shili to Naiv and to Givon. So according to this, we can understand why the Rambam writes at great length in Hilchos Beis HaBechira, starting with Mishkan Sha'asa Moshe Rabbeinu V'hayla Fisha, and then by continuing that came in Shenichnas La'aretz and Midu HaMishkan Ba'Gilgal Arba Esra Shana Shekavshu V'Shechilku. The Rambam is saying this in order to explain that the tzivay of Asuli Mikdash by the Mishkan Moshe was a tzivay for all generations, and that they were fulfilling it when Midu Mishkan Ba'Gilgal V'Chulu. The only difference was in the manner of its kiyum. The Mikdash of Moshe, so since it was built in the Midbar, and it was erected by each journey, so that was in the manner of a Mishkan, which was an oil. It was only Lefisha, temporary. Therefore, this very manner of chiyuv and kiyum continued after Nichnas La'aretz. This manner of being temporary, as long as they were in a state of Lefisha, which is before they completed the Arba Esra Shana Shekavshu V'Shechilku. There was still a temporariness to them, since the Yidden didn't yet conquer and divide the land. When Misham Bo'ul Shili, when the Yidden were in a state of more Menucha and Eretz Yisrael, since it was after Shekavshu V'Shechilku, they already conquered and divided the land, so then they built a Bayis Shalavonim. It wasn't an oil like until then. Now it's already a structure made out of stone. And also we see in the amount of time. It was Shin Samach Teshana Amen Mishkan B'Shilei. It was there for 369 years. However, also afterwards, where they built in Neven Given, and it was only 57 years, Rambam is telling us that also then it was a Mikdash. Meaning, the Rambam writes also regarding Neven Given, that Ubanu Sham Mikdash, even though the Aron wasn't there, and it's called in many places not a Mikdash but a Bamagdela, it's still called a Mikdash, the Rambam says. Since the mitzvah's been in a Mikdash was also then. Like we said, it's a mitzvah for generations. However, since there wasn't a complete menucha from Milchama, so therefore you may never given weren't like the Beis Elamim in Yerushalayim. However, given Bo the Beis Elamim, where then there was a Melech and a Shleimus by David and Shleima, so the mitzvah of Mini Melech was also in the Shleimus, and also there was the Shleimus Menucha from Melchemes Amalek. And in addition, they had the Shleimus of the Beis Hamikdash when it moved and was built in Yerushalayim. And now we're going to move on to answering the rest of question number 1, which is why does the Rambam bring the pasuk of l'shichnei tidushu ubasa shama in Hilchos Malachim? So according to all this, we can understand why in the beginning of Hilchos Malachim, the Rambam talks about all shalish mitzvahs, which was one of our earlier questions in the second group of questions, and why he brings the pasuk of l'shichnei tidushu ubasa shama. So we're going to answer the question of shalish mitzvahs in terms of why it's said over here and not in Hilchos Beis HaBechira. Why it's said, we know, because they're all connected. But why over here and not in Hilchos Beis HaBechira? And also why the Rambam brings the pasuk of l'shichnei tidushu ubasa shama and not the pasuk of Asur L'Mikdash, and also not a pasuk that refers to the Beis Elam and to the Beis Hamikdash in Yerushalayim. This is because he's speaking of the time of Bishas Knisas and La'aretz, after the Kibush V'Chiluk. They already conquered the land, they divided the land, so they're truly in the land. So then they already fulfilled the shalish mitzvahs, which are tluya zu b'zu. So he talks about all 3 mitzvahs, unlike in Hilchos Beis HaBechira, which is referring to already from Moshe Rabbeinu before they entered the land of Eretz Yisrael, and you didn't have all 3 mitzvahs. Even though their ultimate and complete shleimus is only the building of the Beis Hamikdash in Yerushalayim, but still, they're already Knesas on La'aretz, and not yet by the Beis Hamikdash, which was hundreds of years later, but since they already had the Knesas on La'aretz, he speaks about all three mitzvahs. Those already the building of a bias, not an oil like until then, because this is after the 14 years of Kavshu V'cholku, when there was a state of Menucha in Eretz Yisrael, and it was through Yeshua, who was appointed as a Melech, through Moshe Rabbeinu and his Bezdin, like the mitzvah of Minui Melech has to be done for all generations, like it says that Yeshua was appointed Al Pi Bezdin Shal Shivim Skenim Val Pi Navi. So you have over here a bias, a permanence. It's after Kivush Chiluk, so you have that Menucha, and you have a Melech because Yeshua was a real Melech, unlike the Mishkan, which was Lefi Shah. You don't have that bias, and in the midbar from one journey to the next. It's not in a state of Menucha like over here after the Kibush and Chiluk, and we don't find that the Meluch of Moshe was through a minui, even though the Rambam says that Moshe Rabbeinu Melech Haya, but not in the form where the way it's described that a king has to be appointed. So over here the Rambam is already talking about after he entered Eretz Yisrael. So he talks about all three mitzvahs, and he brings the pasuk of L'Shichin Tidushu Basa Shanma, because we're talking about already by Mishkan Shili, because Mishkan Shili already has, like we said, L'Shichin Tidushu Basa Shanma refers to Mishkan Shili. So Mishkan Shili already has the conditions and the qualities and the qualifications of Mishanichn Sula Arts, that they're already in Eretz Yisrael and they already entered a state of permanence which was found by Mishkan Shili. According to this, we can also answer the question asked on the above halacha in Hilchos Beis Abchira regarding what halacha we could learn from this. What could we learn from the fact that the mikdash, all the way starting from Moshe Rabbeinu, was already considered in the gather of the mitzvah of making a mikdash for all future generations. So the Rambam rules, a person is forbidden to make a bias, which is tavnis heichel, and a chsadra, which is tavnis ulam, and a chatzar, which is keneged azara. A person can't make structures similar to the heichel, the ulam, and the azara. Now, since all the listed structures, all the way from the Mishkan of Moshe Rabbeinu, had the din of a mikdash, and by each of them was fulfilled the mitzvah of Asuli mikdash, and it's to the extent that the Beis HaMikdash in Yerushalayim, despite being different than the Mishkan, was built based on the Mishkan, as the Rambam explains that the Beis HaMikdash has to be similar to the Mishkan in its structure, in terms of having a Kodesh HaKadoshim, and a Kodesh, and a surrounding courtyard. So we can say that the Isser of making a bias, Tavnis Eichel, and a Chsadra Tavnis Ulam, and a Chotzer Keneged Azara. It also applies to making a Tavnis of the Mishkan of Moshe Rabbeinu, the Mishkan in Shili, the Mishkan in Noiv, and the Mishkan in Givin. It applies by all of them, from the Mishkan of Moshe Rabbeinu to the Mishkan that was in Gilgal, to the one in Shili, to the one in Noiv, and to the one in Givin. So that's the Nafka Mina and Halacha that we take from this Halacha in the Rambam. The explanation of this in Pnimis Einyanim, Chassidus explains regarding the meaning and order of the Sholosh mitzvahs, that same Tasam Melech, talking about a Melech over here, is the Bechina of Yira. This is because the union of the Melech is that Yara Yes Hashem B'Yeser says, he has Yiras Hashem, and he is Batal to Hashem, and through the Melech, this Yira and Bittul is drawn down, is Nimshach down to the whole nation. Once one already reaches the Bechina of Yira, so the union of it, which is the union of Iskafia, so then there must be Bechias Amalek, the union of V'Yarta Ra, to destroy the bad, which is through his Habcha. So it starts with Iskafia, which is Minui Melech. Then we move on to Mechias Amalek, which is Ishabcha. Only afterwards is one able to and must arrive at the level of Yirei Elah, and this comes through the Beis HaMikdash. Like it says in Mikdashi Tirau, which is the union of Yirei Elah. This level of Yireh comes from the Bechina of Chochmah, the union of Torah. And this is true throughout all the generations, even in the time of Galus, when Mishachar Beis HaMikdash, and that's done through the Daled Amash Halacha. So we have these three different mitzvahs. The first one is the Indian of Iskafia, Yireh Tata, and then you have Ishabcha, and then you have Yirei Elah, which correspond to Minui Melech, Yireh Tata, and Mechias Amalek, Ishabcha, and then Binyan Beis HaMikdash, Mikdashi Tiro, Yirei Elah. According to this, we can understand why the tzivui for the Binyan Beis HaMikdash and also the actual building of the first Mishkan had to be through Moshe Rabbeinu. We see that the tzivui started from Moshe Rabbeinu and the building was by Moshe Rabbeinu. Namshachas Adas to each Yid, which through it one can reach Yira, is through Moshe Rabbeinu. We know that it comes through the Nasi Adar. Therefore, the beginning of the Inyan of Malucha, the Inyan of Yireh Tata, until the building of the Mishkan, the Inyan of Yireh Elah, had to be through Moshe. And the same is true in the Va'asuli Mikdash, Reshachati B'Seichem, in each and every Yid, it comes through the Moshe, which is in every Yid. However, on the other hand, the shleimus of the mitzvah of building the Beis HaMikdash was in the Beis HaMikdash in Yerushalayim. because the Indian of Melucha b'Shleimus and Begali, the way it's revealed, was accomplished through David and Melech, to the extent that it's going to be in the real Shleimus, and the ultimate Shleimus, when Yamin Melech mi beis David Hege Teruma Mashiach comes, va'isik b'mitzvahs keDavid Aviv, and then v'yachav Kol Yisrael leilich bo lechazik bitko. So you have the Indian of a Melech, and then you have the Milchemes Hashem, which is the Indian of Michias Amalek, and then Ubana Mikdash B'Mkeimei. So that's going to happen when Mashiach comes. That then is going to be the Indian of Melech b'Shleimus and the destruction of Amalek in Shleimus, and it's going to be Hashem Malei and the Kisei Hashem Shalim and the Kisei Shalim, which is the Gilui of Hashem's Melucha, and the Shleimus in the building of the Beis Hamikdash as well, which is going to be a binyan nitzchi, an eternal binyan, that Mikdash Adnai Kain Yedecha B'Mheir V'Yameinu B'Karev Mamish.